Another thing that has recently changed when it comes to Xamarin Forms development is that in recent updates, we now need constant permission about whether or not we have access to location, for example. So we need to keep asking the user or evaluating if the user still has provided permissions for our application to access, for instance, their location. So the way it works now, or it used to work with our application, is that we requested permission once, and if the user granted it, we were able to access the location. But again, in recent updates, this has changed. For example, in Android, the user is now able to go to the settings of an application and disable permissions that maybe they had already provided before. So the application needs to make sure that they still have access to that permissions. So what we have to do is implement into our travel record app some extra functionality for us to be able to adapt to these new changes. Fortunately, there is one very useful plugin that we will be able to use to implement this functionality. So what we're going to do is right-click on our solution, and we're going to navigate to Manage Node.js Packages for Solution. In here, we are going to be able to search for the plugin.permissions package. It is probable that it has already been installed before, but if it hasn't, depending on what packages you've been adding to your projects, you will have to install the latest stable version to all of your projects. Now, in my case, I already have it installed, so I won't be doing this. But you will also need to make sure that inside of your Android project, when you manage the Node.js packages for that particular project, you have the plugin.currentActivity package installed. This is another plugin that is actually installed when we add a plugin.permissions package to the Android project that is going to be necessary for us to use the permissions plugin. So having installed this, we will have to add some preparation for this plugin into our Android application. So inside of the main activity, we will have to override a method that will be executed when a permission is requested. So like we've been doing every single time, we're going to write override, and the method that we want to override is the onRequest permission result. So right below the line that calls the base method onRequest permissions result, we will have to call an onRequest permissions result method from a different namespace. And the namespace is permissions implementation. Of course, to be able to use this class, we will need to add a new using directive, which notice is plugin.permissions, which again is coming from the plugin that we just added, then current, and here we have the onRequest permissions result. And we will have to pass the exact same thing that is being received by this method and eventually passed to the base method. So that is the request code, the permissions, and the grant results. Now that we have called this method, you have to double check that a main application.cs file has been added to your Android project. This was automatic when we added that permissions plugin, and you will be able to find the onActivityCreated method that is calling the cross-currentActivity current.activity property and assigning it to the activity being received. If that didn't happen automatically, you will have to assign that particular property inside of the onCreate method of your main activity and assign it to the main activity, so assign it to this. But in my case, this has been correctly executed, so I don't need to do anything else in that side. We can now go back to our portable project where we are going to be implementing the permissions functionality. So here inside of the portable project, we have the new travel page class, where on the onAppHearing, we're currently just calling the get position async from the locator. But this may actually be called without us having the permission to access the location, in which case our application is just not going to work. So here we have to add some extra functionality so we know that the project is going to work. The first thing that I'm going to do is get all of this code that we have below the call of the base method on appearing into a try catch block. So all of this, of course, is going to be inside a try, and we will have the catch, and we are going to be just catching any exception. I am just going to set a breakpoint in here, so in case any exception happens, I can evaluate what was that exception. Now, inside of the try block, the first thing that I will have to get is the status, the current status of the permission. So I am going to create a new variable, which is going to be that status, and we will be able to get this status through cross permission. Of course, to access to this class, you will have to add a using directive to the same namespace that we used for Android. And in here, we're also going to be accessing current and the check permission status async method. Now, this method will allow us to check the status for any permission. The permission for which we want to check the status right now is inside of the permission class, and it's called location. So once we have this status, we have to evaluate if it is granted or not. So to do that, we can evaluate it against the permission status granted value. So I am going to evaluate if it is different than permission status. This class is in a different namespace, so I will have to add a using directive to that one. And this is actually an enumerable that has a granted value. So if we evaluate the status against this one, we will know whether or not the application or the user has granted access. By the way, this is an async method, so I have to await it. That way, the value for this variable is actually a permission status and not a task. So if we do not have this permission, we will have to request it. And it's a very good practice to first evaluate if the current permission that we want to request actually needs the user's permission directly. So if we actually need to display an alert or a message. In this case, we can access this through cross permissions too. And we can access the current, and in this case, it should show request permission rationale async. Again, we're going to be passing the exact same permission, which is location. And this is also async, so we will have to await this. In the case of this being true, we are just going to show this message that we need some permission. So the user knows that we are going to be requesting the permission to access their location. And after this is when we are actually going to be requesting the permission. So we can go from the cross permissions class and also from current the request permissions async, and again the permission that we want is the location. So we access it just like we did for the check permission status async, and it should show request permission rationale async. Now this method, if we await it, which we are going to be doing, is going to return the results of the permissions being requested. So I am going to create a new variable, which is going to be results, that is going to be equal to what this method returns after being awaited. Notice that this is going to be a dictionary of the permission and the permission status. So a new permission status different to the previous status in case the user actually changed what the permission is. So currently remember that the status is not granted. So maybe after this, the result is, or the status is now granted. That will be inside of this results dictionary. So once we have done this, we can evaluate, which is a good practice first, if these results actually contains a key for that permission location. This is going to allow us to evaluate if the user or we have successfully requested permission for the location and we have successfully received a result for that request. So if this result contains that key, we will be able to set the status to a new value, which is going to be what is inside of that particular key. So we have now requested this permission, and the status may have changed. So we know that inside of this if it is not granted, but maybe after this it is granted. But still, it is a good practice to evaluate if this is equal to a granted permission status. If this is true, then we will be able to call the get position async. And we can always add an else statement in case the status wasn't granted, in which case we may need to display an alert telling the user that we don't have their permission, so we cannot proceed. And that's it. This is everything that we need to now make sure that even if the user has changed the status from outside of the application, we can still request that permission every single time it is necessary. This way, if we run the application, for example, on iOS, and this will happen for Android as well, we can actually navigate to the settings of the device. In the case of Android, navigate directly to location. In the case of iOS, we need to navigate to privacy and then location. And in here, we're going to find that application because it is requesting information about the location. And notice how indeed I see, at least right now on iOS, the application that is requesting the usage of location while using the application. The user could always change this to never, but now since we have added these evaluations, if we run the application again, the permission status is not going to be granted. So the next time I navigate back to that new travel page, even though I've just changed that permission, notice that now this time this message is displayed, and now we are going to be requesting the permission one more time, or let the user know that they need to provide that permission. So this is how we provide permissions on Xamarin Forms. Of course, we can use this to request many other different kinds of permission, not just location. As you can see, the plugin allows this to be very straightforward without having to work with some code for Android and some for iOS. This bundles it together into one single plugin that works for both of them.